I have buried 2 people in my life with my own hands, and both times the ground took them quiet, like it had been waiting. So when I tell you that the smallest thing I ever pulled out of that dry creek bed turned out to be worth more than every head of cattle I ever ran, you'll think I mean the strongbox, the silver, the thing the whole county still talks about in the back of the feed store, lowering their voices like it's a sin to say out loud. It wasn't. The most valuable thing I ever found out there had skinned knees and a missing front tooth, and a habit of counting under her breath when she was scared. She didn't change my life because of what she dug up. She changed it because of what she dug out of me, a thing I'd shoveled dirt over a long time before she ever showed up. Let me start where it actually started, not with the gold, with the girl. The morning Nell came to me, I was counting fence posts and pretending I wasn't. That's a habit of mine I'm not proud of. I count things, always have. Posts, nails, the rivets on a saddle, the days my wife had been gone. I keep a tally of the world, like if I lose track of the number, something terrible will slip through the gap. There's a door frame in my kitchen scored with little knife marks, one for every day since the fever took Ruth. And I'd stopped looking at it on purpose because the marks had crept up past my own height, and that felt obscene somehow, that grief could grow taller than a grown man. So I was out at the north line counting posts. 41, 42. The wind was coming off the flats the way it does in late spring, dry enough to crack your lips just from breathing, and I had my hat low and my mind nowhere when the dog started up. Old Pike didn't bark at much. He was a lazy, half-blind healer who'd long decided the world could mostly take care of itself. So when he set to barking short, sharp, the kind that means something's wrong and not something's here, I dropped the count and went to him. She was lying in the wash behind the ridge, in the bit of shade thrown by a dead cottonwood, and at first I took her for a sack somebody had dumped. A bundle of rags. Then the bundle moved, and a face turned toward me, and I felt my own heart do a stupid, frightened thing in my chest. A child, a girl, maybe 10, maybe 11, hard to tell because hunger lies about a person's age, makes them small and old at once. Her lips had that same crack the wind gives, except hers had bled and dried and bled again. One shoe. Her dress had been blue once maybe, in some other life that had a kitchen and a mother and a Sunday. I knelt. My knees popped like green wood. "Hey now," I said, which is a thing I say to spooked horses, and I have no better instinct than that, so it's what came out. "Hey now, easy." She looked at me with eyes that had decided a long time ago that grown men were a kind of whether you survived rather than trusted. And then, this is the part I keep coming back to, she didn't ask for water. She didn't ask for help. She said, in a voice that was mostly dust, "Are you going to make me go back?" I didn't know where back was, didn't know for days, but I knew the shape of that question because I'd heard it once before, from a dog I'd taken off a man who beat it, and the dog had said the same thing with its whole cringing body. "Are you going to make me go back?" "No," I said, "I didn't even think on it. No, I'm not." And the strange thing, the thing that still sits wrong with me, is that she believed me. Just like that. A stranger on his knees in a dry wash, and she let her eyes close and her body go slack, trusting me to be exactly what I'd said. I have never in my life felt the weight of a promise land on me so fast. I picked her up. She weighed about as much as a wet saddle blanket, and I carried her the half-mile back to the house, counting my own steps the whole way without meaning to, because that's the only prayer I know how to say. I'll be honest about something, because Ruth always said I dressed up my own decency to make it sit nicer, and I'm trying not to do that here. I did not take that girl in out of pure goodness. The house had been quiet for 3 years, the kind of quiet that gets into the walls. I'd been talking to the dog and the kettle and the doorframe, and a man who talks to a doorframe is closer to the edge than he'll admit at the feed store. So when I laid her on Ruth's side of the bed and spooned broth into her a half teaspoon at a time over 2 days, watching the color come back into her like dawn coming up slow over the flats, some part of me, some cold and lonely part I'm not proud of, was grateful. Grateful for the work of her. Grateful to have a reason to wind the clock and bank the fire and care whether there was milk. She slept most of 3 days. On the fourth, I came in from the morning chores and she was sitting up, and she'd found Ruth's hairbrush on the dresser and was holding it but not using it, just holding it like it might be a trap. "That was my wife's," I said. "Where is she?" I nodded at the window, toward the rise behind the barn where the 2 markers were. The girl looked, understood, and set the brush down very carefully, exactly where it had been, lining it up with the old dust string like she didn't want me to know she'd touched it. "You can use it," I said. "Hair like that you'll want to." She didn't, though, not that day. It took her a week to use that brush, and when she finally did, she sat in front of the little mirror working out the knots one strand at a time, wincing, refusing to let me help. And I understood that there are people who'd rather hurt themselves slow than let another person near them with a kindness, because kindness had taught them to flinch. I knew the feeling. I'd buried it on the rise with Ruth. Her name was Nell. I learned it the way you'd coax a wild thing to a bowl, slow, no sudden moves. She didn't offer it, I had to wait for it. On the 5th day she said, apropos of nothing, looking at the ceiling, "My mother called me Nell," past tense. A whole grave dug in one little word, and her face didn't change, and that was worse than crying would have been. I didn't ask the rest. I'm a slow man, and I knew the rest would come when it came. What came first instead was the counting. I caught her doing it about a week in. She was helping me, or pretending to, which for a child that thin was the same thing, carry kindling to the porch, and her lips were moving, no sound, and I recognized the shape of it because I do the same fool thing. 1, 2, 3, counting the sticks. "You count too," I said, and it came out softer than I meant. She froze like I'd caught her stealing. "It's a habit," she said, defensive. "It's stupid." "No," I said, "I do it, posts mostly, nails." I pointed my chin at the doorframe before I thought better of it. "Days." She looked at the marks. She was a smart child, too smart, the kind of smart that hunger and grief carve into a person early, and she counted them with her eyes fast. And then she looked at me with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite kinship, but was the first cousin of both. "That's a lot of days," she said. "It is." "Does it help, the counting?" I thought about lying. I thought about saying yes, it helps, the way grown men say things to children to keep the floor under them. But she'd have known. So I told her the truth, which was the first true thing I'd said out loud in 3 years. "No," I said, "but it gives my hand something to do while the rest of me figures out how to keep going." She nodded like that was the most sensible thing anybody had ever told her. Then she went back to counting kindling, out loud now, on purpose, a little louder, and I understood she was doing it with me, letting me hear it, and I had to go split what I didn't need split so she wouldn't see my face do whatever it was about to do. She'd been with me near a month before the strongbox. By then she'd put on enough weight that her wrists didn't look like a bird's legs. She'd taken over the chickens with a ferocity that suggested she'd done it before somewhere for someone and missed it. She'd stopped flinching when I came up behind her. She'd started here and there to talk not about the before, never that, but about now. The hawk that worked the south field. The way Pike groaned getting up. Whether the dun mare was going to foal. Small things. The architecture of a life rebuilt out of small things. I want to be careful here, because the next part is the part everybody wants, and it's the part I care about least. We were down at the dry creek, the both of us, because the spring runoff had finally come and gone and left the bed scoured clean, and that's the best time to find arrowheads, which Nell had taken a shine to. She had a tobacco tin half full of them already, and she'd sort them on the windowsill by size, counting, always counting. We were down there in the late afternoon, the light gone gold and long, the cottonwoods finally green, and she was working a stick into a place where the bank had caved when the water dropped. "There's something," she said. I figured it was a root, or a rock. I went over slow, the way you do at my age, and she'd already got her fingers around the edge of it and was scraping with the single-minded focus of a child who has decided a thing is hers. It was a corner of metal, banded a box. It took us the better part of an hour to work it loose, and by the time we did, the light was going and Nell's hands were filthy to the wrist, and she had a streak of mud across her face like war paint, and she was grinning, the first whole grin I'd seen on her, missing tooth and all, and I'd have given the box back to the dirt happily just to keep that grin a while longer. The lock had rusted to nothing. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff as bark, was money. Coin, mostly silver dollars, some gold, and a leather pouch of the same, and a thing that mattered more than all of it, though I didn't understand that yet. A folded paper, a deed, and a few letters tied with string. I'm not going to pretend my breath didn't go funny. A man who counts posts to feel safe does not look at a strongbox full of silver and feel nothing. I felt the whole shape of an easier life rear up in front of me, fence wire I could finally afford, a second hand for Roundup, a roof that didn't weep in the spring rain. I felt it, and I'm not ashamed of feeling it because feeling it isn't the sin. The sin is in what you do next. And what I did next was look at Nell. She wasn't looking at the silver. She'd pulled the letters out and she was holding them, and her face had gone very still and very white under the mud, and I realized, slow, the way I realize everything, that she recognized the handwriting on the front of them. She didn't read them out loud. She read them to herself, there in the failing light, with me standing over her not knowing whether to speak, and when she finished the top one she pressed it flat against her chest with both hands like she was trying to push it through her ribs and into the place where it belonged. "This is my father's," she said. The bottom dropped out of the afternoon. I won't lay the whole of it out the way it came out, because it came out crooked, over days, in pieces, the way the worst stories always do. But the bones of it were these. Her father had been a freighter, hauling between the railhead and the mining camps up in the hills. He'd been a careful man, a counter like us, I think now, though she never said it, and he'd done well enough to put a little by, and being a man who didn't trust banks, which in that country was less paranoia than common sense, he'd buried it. Buried it in a strongbox in a creek bed on land he'd bought cheap and meant to bring his wife and daughter to. He'd died on the road. Fever, or a wheel, or men with guns. The letters didn't say, and Nell didn't know, and I didn't ask. The land sat. The wife and daughter, with the man gone and the money buried where they didn't know to look, slid down the long greased chute that takes a widow and her child from a house to a relative's charity, to a charity that wasn't charitable to whatever it was Nell had run from when she lay down in my wash to die. The mother had died somewhere in that slide. Nell had run from what came after. And the land, I unfolded the deed with hands I kept steady by force. The land the box was buried on, the land with the creek and the cottonwoods and the dry wash where I'd found her, was not my land. It was hers. I'd been grazing cattle for 3 years on ground that belonged to a dead freighter's orphan girl. The creek where I'd found her dying was her own. She'd come home to die and hadn't even known it was home. I sat down on the bank. Just sat, right in the sand, like my legs had been taken out from under me, which in a way they had. Nell was watching me. She'd stopped reading. The silver lay between us in the oilcloth, dull in the last of the light, and I want you to understand the thing that was happening in my chest, because it's the whole of the story, really. The rest is just weather and dates. I was doing arithmetic. God help me, I was counting. The deed in my hand said this child owned the very ground I stood on. The silver said she had money, real money, more than I'd see in a decade of good years, which meant she didn't need a broke widower and his half-blind dog, which meant the easiest, cleanest, most correct thing in the world had just walked up and offered to take her off my hands. A lawyer in town. A bank. A proper guardian, the kind with a parlor and a piano and no doorframe, scored with 3 years of grief. She had a fortune. She could buy her way to a real life, the life her father had buried that silver to give her, And all I had to do was the honest thing, tell her, take her to town, hand over the deed and let her go. And I sat there in the sand and discovered that I did not want to. That's the heavy part. That's the part I have to tell straight or the whole thing's a lie. For one long, ugly minute with the silver between us, I understood every man who ever cheated an orphan. I understood it from the inside. Because I'd been alone for 3 years and this child had wound the clock of my life back up, and the thought of the house going quiet again, of erasing the little flour-dusted handprint she'd left on the table, of going back to talking to the kettle, was a thing I could not look at directly. And here was the silver, and nobody knew. Nobody knew about the box but the two of us. I could keep the deed in a drawer. I could keep her. I could call it kindness and never tell her what she'd found. She was 11 years old. She couldn't read the deed. She didn't know what the paper meant. The light went down behind the flats. Pike came and sat against me, the way he does, and the warmth of him at my hip was the only thing in the world that felt honest. "What is it?" Nell asked, quiet. She'd seen my face do something. "What's the paper?" And here is where the story turns, and I'll tell you what I did, but I'll tell it in the next part, because the truth is it took me the whole walk back to the house to decide, counting steps the whole way, 240 of them, every one of them a chance to be a worse man than I turned out to be, and you deserve to walk it with me rather than have me hand you the end like a coin. I picked up the box. I held out my hand. She took it, mud and all. We walked home in the dark, and I counted, and I did not say a word the whole way, and she let me have my silence the way she'd learned to let frightened things have what they need. The doorframe was waiting when we got there, 3 years of marks, and for the first time since I'd cut the first one, I stood and looked at it on purpose, and I thought, that's a lot of days to spend keeping count of what you've lost. A man could spend the rest of them the same way, or he could start counting something else. I decided it somewhere around step 190 on that walk home in the dark, though I didn't let myself say so out loud even inside my own head, because a man who's deciding to do the right thing while half his heart is begging him not to does better to keep quiet and just put one foot down after the other until the deciding's done. By the time we reached the porch I knew. By the time I'd banked the fire and watched her fall asleep, instantly, the way only children and the truly tired can, I knew it twice. But I waited for morning, because some things you don't say in the dark. The dark makes liars of honest men and saints of liars, and I didn't trust myself in it. So I made coffee. I made her the cocoa I'd been hoarding since Christmas, the tin I'd bought for a child who'd never come, which is a sentence I've never said to anyone and don't intend to again. I set the strongbox on the table between us in the gray morning light, and I set the deed on top of it, unfolded, and I put my finger on the line where her father's name was written, Thomas Whitfield, in the clerk's careful hand. "This was your father's name," I said. She nodded. She had cocoa on her lip and she didn't wipe it, and she watched me the way she watched the hawk work the south field, total, motionless attention. The attention of a small creature that has learned its life depends on reading the larger creature right. "This paper says he owned this land," I said. "The land we're standing on, the creek, all of it. He bought it to bring you and your mother to." I made myself keep my finger on the name. "It's not my land, Nell. I've been running cattle on it 3 years not knowing. It's yours. It passes to you. The box, the silver, the deed, all of it's yours." I'd thought about how to say it for half the night, and that was the best I could do. And it landed in the kitchen and just sat there, too big for the room. She looked at the deed a long time. Then she looked at me, and the question she asked was not the question I'd braced for. I'd braced for what does that mean, or are we rich, or even can I keep the silver? Children's questions. Instead she said, in that flat, careful voice she used when something mattered too much to risk feeling out loud, "Are you telling me so I'll leave?" And I understood that we were, the two of us, exactly the same animal. That she had spent the night I spent deciding to be honest, bracing to be sent away. That to her, You own this and you have money and you don't need me anymore were the same sentence. The way they'd nearly been the same sentence in my own ugly heart down at the creek. We were both of us counting the ways the other might turn out to be the worst thing we feared. No, I said. Because I can read some, she said, talking faster now, the words coming out ahead of her. I can read enough. I saw the part about the land. I'm not stupid, and I know what people do. They take the paper to the man in town, and the man in town gives it to somebody with a parlor, and then... She stopped. Her hands were flat on the table on either side of the cocoa, pressing down, and I recognized that too, the bracing, the holding the floor in place. I'd rather you just kept it, she said very quietly. The money, all of it, if I could stay. I'd rather you kept it and I stayed than you give it to me and I go. I want to tell you I said something wise. I didn't. I'm not a wise man, only a slow and stubborn one. What I did was take my finger off the deed and put my whole rough hand flat on the table next to her small one, not touching, just near, the way you'd let a half-wild thing close the last inch itself, and I said the truest thing I had. Then we'll keep it together. The land was your father's. The home's going to be yours and mine. I'm not trading one for the other, and I'm not letting anybody in a parlor tell me different. She didn't cry. I've made a point in this telling of saying when she didn't, because the not crying was its own language with her, and this was the loudest she ever not cried in all the time I knew her. She just picked up her cocoa with both hands and drank it, and over the rim of the cup her eyes had gone bright and wet and fierce, and we sat in the gray light and didn't say anything else, and it was the best morning I'd had in 3 years, and I knew it while it was happening, which is rare and worth something. Here is where I tell you the right thing is never free, because if I let you think it was, I'd be dressing up my decency the way Ruth used to scold me for. The trouble started in town. I'm not a town man. I go in for wire and coffee and salt, and to nod at the men I've nodded at for 20 years, and I come home. But a deed's a legal thing and a child's an inheritance, and you can't keep either one in a drawer in the kitchen and call it settled, not honestly, and I just spent a whole night choosing honest. So 2 weeks on, when Nell had been to the creek a dozen more times and filled her tobacco tin with arrowheads to overflowing and started leaving the doors open in the house like a person who expects to come back to it, I hitched the wagon and we went to see the lawyer. His name was Pearsall, a decent enough man, careful, the kind of careful that comes from a lifetime of watching how money makes people lie. He read the deed. He read the letters, the ones tied with string, the ones Nell had let me carry but wouldn't let me read. He had Nell tell her name 3 times and her father's and her mother's and where they'd lived, and he wrote it all down in a hand even neater than the clerk's. And then he set down his pen and rubbed his eyes and told me the thing I hadn't seen coming, because I'm a man who counts fence posts and not a man who understands how the world is wired underneath. The land's clean, he said. Whitfield bought it outright, paid the taxes through to his death, and there's been no claim since. The girl's the heir, no question. These letters establish her plain as day. That's the easy part. He looked at me over his spectacles. The hard part is you. Me. You've been working that land 3 years, improving it, running stock, mending fence, putting up that barn. I'd wager. He tapped the desk. Under the law, a man who works abandoned land in good faith builds up a claim of his own, not a strong one against a clear heir, but a claim. And here's the trouble, friend, she's a minor. She can't hold the land herself. She can't sign. She needs a guardian. And a court that hears a single man, no kin, took in an unrelated orphan girl who turns out to be sitting on a freighter's fortune. He let it hang. That court is going to ask itself one question. And it's the same ugly question that crossed your own mind, or you're a better man than I've met. I didn't say anything. He'd named the thing I'd faced at the creek and not told a soul, and I'll confess my ears went hot. They'll wonder, Pearsall said, not unkindly, whether you took her in for her sake or for the silvers, and they will not take your word for it, because every man who ever robbed an orphan said the same words you'd say. He leaned back. There's people in this county would be glad to make that argument. The land's good. The water's better. A man with a parlor and a banker for a brother-in-law could petition to be her guardian himself, manage her estate till she's grown, and squeeze it dry doing it, all legal, all for the child's protection. He said the last word the way you'd hold up something rotten. You follow. I followed. That was the trouble with being a slow man. Once I followed a thing, I followed it all the way down, and I followed this one down into a dark I hadn't known was there. By being honest, by bringing the deed to town instead of keeping it in a drawer, I'd done the right thing, and the right thing had put Nell square in front of every grasping hand in the county. If I'd stayed quiet, she'd have stayed mine and stayed poor and stayed safe. By telling the truth, I'd made her worth taking. I sat in that office and counted the books on Pearsall's shelf to keep my hands from shaking. 31, 32. What do I do? I said. You petition for guardianship yourself, he said. Today, first, before anyone else thinks to, and you make it stick. He pulled a fresh sheet toward him. Which means a judge has got to believe a thing that's hard to believe, friend, which is that you'd have kept that girl whether the box held silver or held nothing but a dead man's letters. I thought about the cocoa tin I'd bought for a child who never came. I thought about the doorframe. It held both, I said, and I'd have kept her for the letters. Pearsall looked at me a long moment, and something in his careful face eased. I believe you, he said. Now we've got to make a judge do it. The next part is waiting, and waiting is the hardest thing to put in a story because nothing happens in it and everything does. The petition went in. The county did exactly what Pearsall said it would. Word got around that the Whitfield girl was an heiress, and the grasping hands woke up. A man named Cobb, who owned the freight office now and had a parlor and, sure enough, a banker brother-in-law, filed a counter-petition within the month. He had a wife who'd never wanted children and suddenly wanted this one. He had a lawyer slicker than Pearsall and a way of saying the child's best interest that made me want to wash. He pointed out, true enough, that I was a widower of no relation, living alone, miles from a school or a church or a doctor. A man who, and his lawyer found this out somehow, which told me he'd had somebody asking around, a man who'd been seen talking to himself, who kept a kitchen doorframe scored with knife marks like a calendar in a prison cell, who was, the lawyer suggested gently, perhaps not entirely sound after the loss of his wife. I'll tell you that one cut, because it wasn't a lie. I had been talking to the kettle. I had cut those marks, and sitting in a courtroom listening to a stranger lay out the inside of my grief as evidence that I wasn't fit to raise a child, that I might have wanted the silver because what kind of sound man takes in a strange orphan otherwise? I came as close as I've come since Ruth to just folding up. What stopped me was Nell. She'd been brought in to be looked at, the way they look at a child in a custody fight, like a parcel everyone wants to weigh. They asked her questions. Cobb's lawyer asked them soft and sideways, trying to get her to say I'd frightened her, or kept her, or that the house was a sad, strange place. And Nell, 11 years old, in the clean dress Pearsall's wife had found for her. Her hair brushed out with Ruth's brush, which she used every day now. Nell sat in the big chair with her feet not reaching the floor and answered every question with that flat, careful, truth-telling voice, and she did not give them 1 inch. They asked if I was kind to her. She said I'd carried her half a mile when I didn't know her and had no reason to. They asked if the house was a sad place. She said it had been, and that we'd been fixing it, her and me, day by day, and that fixing a sad place was different from a place just being happy, and she'd take the fixing. They asked, and this was the slick lawyer's mistake, because he asked it to wound, they asked whether I'd told her about the silver, or whether I'd tried to keep it from her, hidden it, kept it for myself. And Nell looked at him, and then she looked at me, and then she said something I have carried every day since, in that small, flat voice that filled the whole room. He found out it was all mine, the land and the money. He found out before I did, and he could have kept it and nobody would have known because I can't read good enough to know what the paper said. She paused and counted something. I saw her lips move, 1, 2, gathering it. He made me cocoa and he put the paper down in front of me and he showed me my own father's name with his finger and he told me. He didn't have to tell me. He told me anyway. And then he said we'd keep it together and he wasn't trading one for the other. She turned to the judge. A man who wanted my money would have kept the paper in a drawer. I'd never have known. He's the one who took it out of the drawer. You should ask Mr. Cobb if he'd have taken it out of the drawer. The courtroom was very quiet. Pearsall, beside me, made a small sound like a man setting down something heavy he's carried a long way. I'll be honest one more time because I promised I would. I have been counting things my whole life to feel safe, and in that quiet courtroom I did not count anything at all. For once my hands were still. I just looked at that girl with her feet not reaching the floor, telling a roomful of grown men the exact truth in the exact order it had happened, defending me with the one fact that mattered, that I'd opened the drawer, and I thought, I came to this town to do right by her, and here she is doing right by me, and somewhere her father is, I hope, not sorry he buried that box. The judge didn't rule that day. Judges never do, at the moment you need them to. He took it under advisement, which is a fine phrase that means a child and a tired man go home to wait and don't sleep. We drove back in the dusk. Nell was quiet a long while, watching the flats go by, the cottonwoods we passed throwing their long shadows across the road. Pike rode in the wagon bed with his chin on the rail. Somewhere out there to the west was the creek, her creek, where the box had been, where I'd found her, and the runoff would be long gone now, and the bed scoured clean and waiting for next spring. What happens if they give me to Cobb? She said. Not scared. Just counting the possibilities the way we both did, laying them out to look at so none of them could sneak up. They won't, I said, which was a thing I had no right to say. But if they do? I thought about lying. I'd thought about lying a lot in my life and mostly done it to myself. But I'd spent a whole night learning not to lie to her, so I didn't. If they do, I said, then a rich man with a parlor will have your land and your silver and a girl who hates him, and somewhere a few miles off an old fool will be talking to his kettle again. And neither one of us will be better for the silver. That's the truth of it. The silver was never the thing, Nell. Your father didn't bury that box so you'd be rich. He buried it so you'd be safe. Those aren't the same. And any man who thinks they are has never been either one. She was quiet again. Then she said very low, I don't want the silver, I want the door frame. I didn't understand. The door frame. The marks, she said. All those days I want, and here her careful voice finally cracked just a hairline, the first I'd ever heard it do that. I want you to start cutting a new mark. A different one, for the day I came, and count from there. Not from when she couldn't say died, she never could, not from the sad number. A new number starting at 1. I had to stop the wagon. I told her it was the dun mare wanting a rest, but it wasn't the mare. It was me, sitting in the road with the reins slack in my hands, because a child who'd lost everything had just told me how to put down a grief I'd carried 3 years, and she'd done it with arithmetic, with the only prayer either of us knew how to say, and I could not for the life of me get my throat to work. When I could, I clicked to the mare and we went on. I didn't answer her out loud. But that night after she was asleep, I took my knife to the door frame, and below the last of the 3 years of marks I cut a single new line, deeper than the others, clean, and I stood and looked at it a long while in the lamplight. 1. The first day of a number I meant to keep. I'd tell you what the judge decided, but you've waited this long with me, and it's only fair you wait the last little stretch the way we waited it, not knowing, in a quiet house, with a new mark on the doorframe and a tobacco tin full of arrowheads on the sill and an old dog groaning to get up in the mornings. The ruling came 11 days later. I counted them. Of course I counted them. And what came of it, and the thing that happened after, the thing I never saw coming, the reason I tell this story at all, that's the last part, and I'll give it to you whole. The ruling came on a Tuesday, 11 days after the courtroom, and I want to tell you I was calm about it, but I'd worn a path in the kitchen floor by then that I think is still there. Pearsall rode out himself to bring it, which I knew the meaning of before he was off his horse. A man doesn't ride 2 hours to deliver bad news he could send by letter. Bad news travels fine by paper. He came up the track in the late morning with his hat in his hand already, and Nell saw him from the chicken yard and went very still, the way she did, bracing. And I went and stood next to her without a word because that's all bracing wants, company in it. Guardianship's yours, Pearsall said, before he'd even dismounted, because he was a decent man and he knew the cruelty of making us wait the length of a greeting. The judge granted it clean. Cobb's petitions denied. The estate's held in trust for the girl till she's of age. You're the trustee and the guardian both, and there's not a thing Cobb or his banker can do about it but be sore. I heard it. I understood the words. And then I had to sit down on the porch step because my legs did the thing they'd done at the creek. Just quit. And Nell didn't sit. Nell stood in the chicken yard with the hens fussing around her ankles, and she put both her hands over her mouth. And over the top of them her eyes found me. And we just looked at each other across the dirt, the two of us. Neither one crying. Both of us so far past crying that crying would have been a relief we couldn't reach. The judge wrote something, Pearsall said, fishing in his coat. Asked me to read it to you both particular. He found the paper, settled his spectacles, and read it out in the still morning air. I won't give you all of it, but the part I kept, the part I've got by heart, was this. The judge wrote that in 30 years on the bench he'd heard 100 men swear they'd act in a child's interest, and he'd learned to trust none of them on their word. What he trusted, he wrote, was the order of a man's actions. And the determining fact in this matter was that the guardian had disclosed the inheritance to the child before securing any claim to it himself. That he had, the judge wrote, taken the paper out of the drawer when leaving it, there would have cost him nothing and gained him everything. A man's character, the judge wrote, is most plainly read in what he does when he believes no one is counting. Nell looked at me when Pearsall read that last part. When he believes no one is counting. And I knew we were both thinking the same fool thought, that the whole of our 2 lives had been spent counting precisely because we were each, in our own way, terrified that no one else ever would. Cobb didn't take it gracious. I'll give him a sentence and no more because he doesn't deserve the room. He sold the freight office within the year and moved his wife and his parlor to a bigger town with bigger fish, and I never spoke his name in my house again, and neither did Nell. And that's the most fitting thing I can do to him, leave him out of the rest of the story, which is the part that mattered. Because here is the thing I never saw coming. Here is the reversal. The one I teased you with, the reason I sat down to tell this whole long story at all. It was the letters. Nell had carried those letters since the creek, the ones tied with string in her father's hand, and she'd let me hold the box and the deed and the silver, but never those. She kept them under her pillow. I knew because I'd see the string end peeking out when I came to put out her lamp, and I never touched them, because a man who's learned not to touch his dead wife's hairbrush knows that some things belong to the grief and not to the living. It was near a year on. The new number on the doorframe had climbed. I cut a fresh mark every morning, deep and clean, the way she'd asked, counting up from 1. And somewhere past 300 the old marks above it had stopped looking like a prison calendar and started looking like what they were, which was a wall a man had survived against. Nell was 12 now, taller, the missing tooth grown and crooked and her not caring, brown from the sun, a girl with land and silver and a future, and a way of bossing the hens that would have frightened a cavalry sergeant. One evening she came and sat by me at the table while I was doing the accounts, and she set the letters down between us, the string undone. I want you to read them, she said. I've read them enough times to know them. I think, she counted, lips moving, gathering it, I think you should read them too, because they're about you, sort of, even though he never met you. I didn't understand. I picked up the top one. It was her father's hand, the careful hand of a careful counting man, and it was a letter to her mother, written from the road, and it was full of the small freight of a working man's love, the price of grain, a horse gone lame, kiss the girl for me, the date he hoped to be home. Ordinary. Wholly in the way only ordinary things get to be once the person's gone. But the last one was different. It was dated late, near the end, and it wasn't to her mother. It was to Nell, to a daughter too young at the time to read it, written by a man who must have felt the road getting darker around him, the way men do. I'll not give you the whole of it. Some things even a story has to leave under the pillow. But he wrote to her about the box. He wrote that he'd buried it on the land he'd bought, and he drew the creek and the dead cottonwood so she'd know the place. And then he wrote the thing that took the legs out from under me a second time, sitting at my own kitchen table a year later. He wrote, "I'm not leaving you this silver so that you will be rich. Money runs through hands like water, and I have watched it ruin better men than me. I am leaving it so that whoever finds you, and someone will find you, my Nell. The world is not all hard, so that whoever finds you and is good to you will never have to choose between keeping you and keeping food on the table. I am buying that man's kindness a little room to breathe. Whoever he is, tell him. A man who is good to my daughter has already paid for everything that box holds and owes me nothing, and I thank him from wherever I am." I had to put the letter down. You understand what he'd done. You understand it before I can say it, probably, because you've been ahead of me this whole telling. I'm a slow man, I've said so. But sit with it the way I had to. That freighter, that careful counting stranger, dying somewhere on a dark road years before I ever knelt in a dry wash, he'd reached forward across all that time and all that distance, and he'd forgiven me. He'd forgiven me for the ugly minute at the creek when I'd done the silver arithmetic and thought about keeping the deed in a drawer. He'd known a man like me would come. He'd known there'd be a minute like that. And he'd buried the silver not to test that man but to spare him, to make sure that when the man chose, he'd be choosing free, not choosing between the girl and his own survival. He'd buried a fortune so that my kindness wouldn't have to be a sacrifice. And I'd nearly stolen it from him, from a dead man, from the one stranger in the world who'd already decided to thank me. "He says you don't owe him anything," Nell said quietly, watching my face. "That's the part I wanted you to read. Because you do this thing," she counted, 1, 2, "you do this thing where you think you got something you didn't pay for. The cocoa tin. She nodded at the doorframe, the marks. You think you're behind on something. I've watched you. You think me coming here was something you got for free, and you're scared somebody's going to come collect." She put her small brown hand flat on the table next to mine, near, not touching, the old way. "My father already paid. He says so right there. So you can stop counting what you owe. You don't owe anybody. You can just have it. I have buried 2 people in my life with my own hands. I told you that at the start. I did not cry at either grave. The ground took them quiet, and I stood dry-eyed and counted the shovelfuls because that's the only prayer I know. I have been, my whole life, a man the tears wouldn't come to, and I'd half decided that was just the make of me, that some men are built without the spillway and have to carry the water. I cried at that kitchen table. Finally. A year and some after she came, 3 years and some after Ruth, with a dead freighter's forgiveness in my hands and his living daughter's palm an inch from mine. I put my face down and I cried the way the ground had been waiting for me to. And Nell didn't say a word, and she didn't pat me or fuss. She just moved her hand the last inch and put it over mine and let me. The way I'd once let her have her silences in the dark, company and the bracing, which is all any of us ever wants. I should stop there. A better storyteller would. But you've come the whole way with me, and you ought to know how it sits now. The shape of the life that silver bought, though it didn't buy it, that's the whole point. The freighter was right. The silver wasn't ever the thing. We didn't get rich. We could have. The land's good and the water's better and the silver was real. But Nell and I sat down one night with the accounts and we did the arithmetic together. The 2 of us counting, of course, it's the only way we know, and we decided the silver would do what her father meant it to do, which was buy room to breathe and not one thing more. We fixed the roof that wept in the spring. We hired a second hand for roundup, a young fellow named Tomas with a steady way about him. We put the rest in Pearsall's trust for when she's grown, and she's never once asked after it, because a girl who learned the difference between rich and safe at 11 doesn't confuse them again. She went to school in town, boarding the week and home Fridays, and the house was quiet 4 days out of 7, and I won't pretend it wasn't hard. But it was a different quiet, a quiet with a Friday in it. A man can stand any silence that's got a Friday on the other end of it. Pike died the spring she turned 13. He was old when he found her in the wash, and he was older after, and he went the way good dogs go, in his sleep against the warm of the stove, and I buried him on the rise near Ruth. And Nell came home that Friday, and we stood at the little grave, and she counted under her breath, and I counted under mine, and we didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that the counting didn't say better. I'll tell you, of all the graves I've stood at dry-eyed, that's the one that finally taught me I'd become a man who could weep at them. Small mercies come crooked. Sometimes a dog has to teach you what two people's deaths couldn't. The doorframe's near full now. The old marks, the 3 years of grief, are up high where I cut them, and I leave them because Nell was right. A wall you survived against is worth keeping. And below them runs the new number, the one that starts at 1, the one I cut fresh every morning, and it's climbed past the old grief now, well past. More days of her here than there ever were of Ruth gone. And the morning the new number passed the old one, I stood and looked at it a long while and understood that grief doesn't end. It just gets outgrown, like a child outgrows a fear of the dark. Not by the dark getting smaller, but by the child getting bigger. She's near grown now. She'll have the land and the trust when she's of age, and she'll do something good with it, I've no doubt, because she's never once forgotten what it's for. She still counts when she's scared. She still won't let anybody brush her hair but herself. She still won't say died, she says gone, always gone, and I've stopped trying to fix it, because maybe she's right and they're not the same. Maybe nobody's ever all the way gone who left letters under a pillow that can reach across years and forgive a stranger before he's even done his wrong. People in the county still talk about the Whitfield fortune, the silver in the creek. They lower their voices about it at the feed store like it's a thing that happened to somebody lucky. And I let them. I don't correct them, because the fortune was never the silver, and a man can't explain that to people who weren't knelt in the wash that morning, and don't have a door frame scored with the proof of it, and never read the last thing a careful counting man wrote to a daughter he knew he wouldn't see grown. She found a fortune in that creek bed, all right. The whole county's got that part right. They've just got the wrong idea about who found what, and who was the treasure, and who got dug out of the dark by whom. I keep the last letter in the drawer now. Hers by rights, but she said I should hold it. I take it out some evenings when the house is in its Friday-less quiet, and I read the part where her father thanks me, and I sit with the strange grace of being forgiven by a man I never met for a sin I never quite committed, and I think about the order of things, the way the judge said, what a man does when he believes no one is counting. Somebody was counting. That's the thing I'd tell you if you came out to the porch and asked me. Somebody's always counting, even the ones long gone, even the ones who buried their love in the ground and drew you a map to it.